those microaggressions were also at home, right? My grandmother, for instance, who's from my Black side, would always, until recently, just ask, why don't I brush my hair so it looks like my sister's hair, right? Because obviously, if I would brush it, then it would be straight. So those are the microaggressions that we've lived with. However, you just never knew. Abuelita, ay, this is my hair, así es como soy, y ya, ¿no? So those were things. Now, when I realized that I was Black is when I moved to the US. And one of my supposed friends from school, a Latina who is white from South America, called me Nietzsche. And I never knew what that word was, but the feeling was yucky. I just knew that she was saying something bad. Not until years later that I found out there was a Grupo Nietzsche from Colombia, and then I realized, like, oh, they're all Black. Okay, that's what that meant. So there's always been that. Things that I didn't know at school, which now I'm thinking about, is like my counselor at school. Every time we were supposed to have our time, our one-on-one time to talk about my career, we talked about boys. Now, one could say, well, esta niña que vino de Panama and thinks that all these cute boys in school are cute, maybe that's what the counselor wanted to chat about. But there is a possibility that this white Latina could just probably have thought, this girl's probably going to get pregnant soon. She's probably not even going to go to college, so why even engage her? I never knew about SATs. I never knew. There was like so many things that there was an opportunity for her to tell us that she lacked. I still don't know if she talked to my white counterparts about college in a way that she never talked to me about that, but I won't know. At work, microaggressions are, well, I worked on TV, so I look like the fun one. So my hair's not professional. When I would straighten it out, they'll be like, ay, pero qué linda te ves. Now I look professional. Now I am. If you would say like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you call me la negrita? Ay, porque es que tú eres mi negrita. You know, it's just te lo digo de cariño. But I'm like, if you look at it, how many white people are called, ay, tú eres mi blanquita? It's not really a thing. So those are a lot of the things that you go through that I find that as Afro-Latina is very important. Now, in the Latino community, we love to assume that there's no color because the moment that we flew or crossed or whatever, however we got to the US, there's this feeling that we're all Latinos, we're all one. And sure, that is true in many cases, but it's not when it comes to racial equity and racial equality. Again, going to the media, you could see everybody that works on TV, they're all white. You don't see Afro-Latinos. And then of course people will be like, but you know, Ilia Calderon is there. And you're like, yeah, name 10, because I could name you 20 white Latinos that are in the media. But I need to emphasize that it's not only a Black issue, it's also a Native or Indigenous issue. Tampoco, we don't see Indigenous people prominently on TV, which is also an issue. So anyway, we could continue that conversation, but I think I should send it back to you, Ellie.
Thank you. Annette, that's been wonderful. And before, we have 2 more minutes before we turn it over to Ramon. So I have one question for you. When and how did you come to own being an Afro-Latina?
That is really interesting. I need to think about that a little bit more. I've been educating myself when it comes to reading. I've always been curious of just having friends from different areas. It's just until really recently, I would say now that I moved to DC, so in the past 7 years, that I've actively wanted to have African-American friends. So to incorporate that, my partner's African-American, so I'm learning more about that culture. But when it comes, I think when I kept going back to Panama and my cousins are like, ay, mi cabello is just like yours, but it's all straight. All my cousins have straight hair, although it's pressed. So it's just like when I started finding out that I'm like, oh, this is my power. Another, I'm going to shout out my friend Genevieve Williams, who's here too. She's taught me so much about loving negritud, and the more I'm learning about it, the more I'm loving it. And for instance, one of the things that I always leave my hair curly when I go back home, is because I have a niece that has curly hair, and I want her to know this is beautiful and you need to be proud of it. And she's, I think she's understanding that now.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Annette. We really appreciate your transparency and also just sharing with us what your walk has been or what it continues to be. Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Ramon Marmolejos. He is co-founder and partner at Mzigo Group, LLC. Ramon, welcome.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. And really wanted to just share, a similar kind of story on my end, and hopefully it can resonate with you all. I think there are a few things that I've learned that have worked and served me well. I think one thing that I've learned is this concept of how do you walk in your own truth through your life and through the work that you do. I think this idea of, as well, how do we recognize our own privilege? I'm really interested in this conversation around white privilege, but I think also recognizing that we all have privilege in any space that we enter, and how we use that privilege is really important. And then I think this concept of creating impact in our spheres of influence, particularly in times when I find that we can become so frustrated and really wanting to take action and create change, but maybe not knowing how to. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about those 3 points. But for me, I self-identify as Afro-Latino. I was born in the Dominican Republic, immigrated when I was a child with my family to New York. So also consider myself very much a New Yorkino. And currently working in leadership development, and been fortunate to live in a lot of different countries and a lot of different places, and right now based in Australia. And this idea of walking in your truth is something that I've been a strong focus for me. So colorism is something that I've experienced all throughout my childhood. As we know, the Dominican Republic particularly has a very complicated history with race and ethnicity. And it's fascinating, the fact that something like 80+% of the population is mulatto. But when you look at identification cards, cedula, they'll only indicate as Indio. And I'm thinking, wow, Indio, that's interesting. And so I think I remember very clearly, this idea of colorism and of course the focus on fair skin, and particularly in the Dominican Republic, and with a complicated history with Haiti and a lot of the discrimination that's happened both formally and informally through the history of both countries. That seeps into the culture and everyday language. So I remember very clearly my grandmother, whenever I'd go out to play, she'd tell me, "Muchacho, quítate del sol, te va a volver haitiano." And I was like, okay, so you're gonna turn Haitian, all right. So clearly the message was that you do not want to be dark skinned, right? And I remember clearly too, when you're growing up, the question of where are you from is one that was always a complicated one, right? And living, I think, between both worlds and not necessarily feeling part of either, right? Julia Alvarez talks about this idea of living in the hyphen, right? If we talk about ourselves as, myself as Dominican hyphen American. So how do you live in that hyphen, in that in-between space? I think that was always difficult for me. And it wasn't until I faced that, I was always finding myself running away from that instead of stepping into that power, which I think has been a process for me, right? And so understanding that actually in that hyphen, we have power. In that space, we have the ability to influence and make changes around us, to act as facilitators, to act as as people who can help build bridges. And so that was really powerful for me. And it was, you know, it really wasn't until I got to college where that became very clear to me. I just started asking why, you know, and started really pulling at the thread of what was going on institutionally across the country and in my own experience. I started asking why did my parents immigrate from the Dominican Republic? Why did we live where we lived? Why was I fortunate to go to good public schools in Queens, New York, whereas I had other family members that didn't? Why was I the only one in my family to have a university degree? And so all of those questions really confronted me with the racism that we lived with, the structural racism, and then also this idea of how do we define ourselves as opposed to just being defined by others. And so that's when really this idea of that consciousness really awoke for me. And then I confronted it very quickly in my first job. So I sort of said, I made it. I got my college degree, went to an Ivy League, and my first job is doing corporate finance. And very quickly, you know, experienced those microaggressions, right? So they would say, oh, you're from the Dominican Republic. Oh, so you grew up playing baseball barefoot with a stick and plantain leaves for a glove. And I was like, no, that was not my experience. But I played, you know, I'm tall, so I played basketball. and just realizing what we do to make other people feel comfortable. You know, I think that was one of the things that I started realizing as well. So what are the things that we do to deny, you know, these microaggressions and play them off? And that's something that I've also noticed. So part of that is this idea of dismantling denial for me, and to dismantle kind of this denial that we hold on to in some ways collectively, I think is important. I think so this idea of walking in your truth is important for me. The other thing is this concept of recognizing our own privilege. So, you know, in certain ways I felt like, oh yeah, I made it. I the quote unquote, the American dream, you know, got the college degree, went to the schools I needed to go to, got the job I wanted, but ultimately wasn't really creating the impact that I wanted, and ultimately said, I need to move on, and decided to really focus my career on how to create inclusive spaces. And so worked in that space and realized that, you know, how do you also create opportunities for others to walk in their truth, right? And so how do you help people kind of pursue that? You know, one of the things that I've experienced recently with everything that's happened in the US and being here in Australia and understand and being frustrated because of the physical distance in certain ways, but also recognizing that at some point I needed to speak out, and I needed, because I think there is something around this concept that that if we are silent, then we are complicit in what's happening, right? And so how do we then use our spaces to create that kind of influence is something that I've also been thinking a lot about. And so how do we work in this spectrum in my mind between kind of allyship and anti-racism, I think is something that I've also been exploring more of. And then the third thing that I wanted to connect around was this concept of how do we create impact in our spheres of influence. And so it can be really frustrating. Like I mentioned, for me, it was personally frustrating to see what was unfolding and feeling a bit helpless, tired, and just consistently seeing this violence that's happening in these communities. And ultimately said, well, where can I have impact? And I think the first place is family. And for the first time in my family, we were having deep conversations about what does this mean in terms of race, with my brother, with my nieces that are now college aged, and to really sit back and ask ourselves, how are we a part of this, and how are we being impacted by this in a way that we never talked about growing up. This was something that we just didn't do. How do we create spaces for dialogue in our work as well? So how do we create spaces for people to really be open and share their own truth. I think that's really been a big focus for me. And then how do we think about our impact in our community? So now, you know, understanding that we have a lot of privilege in so many different ways, and that privilege and that comfort kind of, you know, it seeps in very slowly over time. And so this has given me a time to really reflect as well and start kind of doing the work. You know, we're continuous works in progress. So for me, it's like doing the work, you know, reading, connecting with my friends, connecting with experts around the world around some of these topics to really, really understand and uncover a lot of the blind spots that I've developed. You know, so even though I work in this space and I try to help others, you have this recognition that we develop our own blind spots around some of this is really important. So those are the things I wanted to share, this idea of just, yeah, how do we walk in our truth? How do we kind of recognize our own privilege, but then also know that we can have a lot of influence in the different circles that we're in. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Ramon. And to our audience, if you have any questions for either Annette or Ramon, this is your opportunity to write your questions into the chat section so that we can engage in a little bit more dialogue with our two panelists. But as I was hearing both of you speak, there are two things that stood out for me, right? There was that personal recognition of where you stood in the spectrum. And Ramon, you used that perfect phrase of living in the hyphen, right? Here we are having to conform or try to bounce back. I think the way we even talk about it today, maybe even code switching, right, between cultures so that we can fit in and navigate within society and even within our own community. And then the second thing that you both said is that you were both intentionally engaging with other people. So Annette, you said that you're dating someone who is a person of color and that you are purposefully going out to learn more about African-American history and about the African-American experience in the US. And Ramon, you said that you are engaging in dialogue with your friends and your family, and that you're both asking yourselves, how can I play a role in this movement and in this situation? And I think it's wonderful that you are living these parallel lives. And I think it's a perfect model of what we should be doing as well. I think this forum is a great platform to be able to start that for our own personal journeys if we haven't already launched those journeys. So Griselda, are there any questions that are coming through on the chat for our panelists?
Thank you, Lino. Not a question, but there's a really good statement about, and I love that. I think we're gonna make this as a hashtag, living in the hyphen. It will be trending pretty soon. There's a comment from Frank Messina, a great collaborator of HACE, who mentioned something that I think should be shared with everybody beyond the chat box. And he says that living in the hyphen opens the possibility of a future in which hyphens celebrate our mixed heritage. So let's hope that, let's hope we move towards that.
It looks like there's a question that just came through the chat that says, does anyone actually identify as a Black Latinx on the panel? Annette or Ramon, do you identify as a Black Latinx?
I think it's more like, does she or he mean Black Latinx versus Afro-Latinx or Afro-Latino? I am fine with whichever. I am Afro-Latina, I'm Afro-Latinx, I am Black Latinx. I mean, I am okay with all of them. So it's more, to me, that sounds more like, do you pronounce Raveno or Raveno? And I'm like, whatever you want.
Yeah, for me as well, I think, yeah, I no doubt about it, regardless of whether I also consider myself Black Latinx, other people do, you know, and I think that's also part of, for me, is owning that and knowing that that's the fact, and that we are impacted in our communities based on that. You know, when I talk about my family in Dominican Republic, and I look at like the interesting dichotomy a lot of times where they think of themselves as fair-skinned and light-skinned in the Dominican Republic. You go to the US and all of a sudden they're called Black, and they're like, wait, what? Yes, we are Black. This idea of understanding that ultimately the context is important, but also the ability to understand that what are we, you know, how do we, I was talking about this idea of kind of coming face to face with that denial and dismantling that denial. that we share as well. So we know that we have to own that. Regardless, we have to own that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in the U.S., if you don't mind, in the U.S. specifically, Black African Americans want to identify the word Black. And so yes, I am a Black woman. I think Afro-Latina or Afro-Caribeña or Afro-Latinx, to me, Annette, it means more of, let me tell you where I'm also coming from, not only my, what's inside my blood, if that makes sense. So I understand the comments from the person that messaged. Yes, I'm definitely Black. O sea, 100%, yo soy, bueno, tampoco 100%, pero because my mom is not, and I'm not denying any of my heritage. But yes, I'm Black Latina and I am Afro-Latina.
And to Ramon's comment earlier, thank you for that, Annette. There's a question from Edgar. Because colorism has been an intentional construct in our cultures, how can we be intentional with reversing it? What are some of the ways that you can change things at home with our family?
Yes, so for me, it's been interesting, like I said, for having these conversations, having these very frank conversations. And I have all kinds of diversity in my family where my dad voted for Trump. So you can imagine the conversations that I have to have with him. But also, I think, how do we hold these conversations in a way where we can also respect and see each other's truth, if that makes sense? Because I think we live in such a polarized society that I'm also, I think, I do a lot of work with companies, et cetera, and workshops. Having these conversations with family is the most difficult space ever. And for me, it's for me to just, know that I need to have empathy and show empathy with the other, and then help create questions and spaces for them to start questioning some of their own assumptions. And so that's what's happened with my nieces, to the point where now my nieces are now for the first time uncovering their own Afro-Latina identity. And for that, and to give them resources and to connect them with people, I think that's really powerful. So I think it's having these spaces where we can avoid the polarizations and we can avoid the judgment of others. And let me tell you, there's no other space more difficult to do that than with family.
I think if we start just understanding where all the racism and colorism comes from, it's not our fault, regardless of whatever where your family came from. That is, it's not your fault. So it's not that you have to be ashamed or embarrassed or anything about like, well, I'm this and I didn't know. It's about right now. Right now, you started the conversation, the situation about there is colorism, there is racism within our own community. How we also perpetrate what's happening in the media, and what's happening, not in the media, but what's happening in the country with Black people, period. So understanding to have those tough conversations, as Ramon was saying, but also let's educate ourselves. Let's understand that because of the racism, there's we're segregated. So a lot of us don't even have the luxury of living with people that don't look like us. So then we have to go out. If you have a child, make sure that you try to go to the YMCA or to whatever organization or recreational center where there are more children of different colors. So then your children would be able to be, just have more context and have more friends. All that is part of it. It's not just feeling guilty. It's like, how do I take action from now moving forward?
Thank you. There's one more question along those lines.
For your willingness to share your experiences. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to move us along because we're already 3 minutes into the next panel. But thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for kicking our dialogue off. I'd like to turn it over to Josie Lassa Gallagher, who will facilitate the next panel on understanding white privilege and how to respond to microaggressions. Josie, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Ellie. I'm so energized just by what we've been talking about. This is one of my a soapbox I say to folks. I'm Afro-Latina, I'm Afro-Cuban, and what am I my identity is however I wake up, but I know I'm Afro and the other part is Cuban. And it's something I think both of you mentioned. Educating is so important because we are not aware about our history, and that this is going on forever. And the piece about Annette that you talked about, guilty, I think we should celebrate. I mean, it's not either or. We are a richness of having that mix, and I think that's something that's not clearly understood. When we do the history, I was researching for today, and I don't know how many of you realize that Mexico and Peru combined enslaved more Africans than the U.S. I mean, it's something that we don't know our own history. So Ramon was mentioning to really understand where we are today is to really go back and then rejoice in the fact that we are that hyphen, that we bring not only the hyphen, but that whole intersectionality that Ellie talked about. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our two panelists today. We have Nereida Perez, HR and Global Head of D&I at McCormick and Company, and she has over 25 years of working in the global space. And we also have Dr. Danielle Pilar Cleland, who has PhD in political sciences and MA in Latin American Caribbean Studies, and her research examines comparative racial politics, group consciousness, Black public opinion, and racial inequity with a focus on Spanish-speaking Caribbean and the U.S. And understand you were in Florida, Pilar, but now you're in Austin. And I think you were in transit as we were trying to talk and work on this. So we're gonna focus a little bit more on microaggressions that we experience and that we might not even be aware that we're inflicting on others. And when we talk about microaggressions, we're talking about those brief, commonplace verbal behaviors or nonverbal behaviors that are indignities that communicate really hostility. They're derogatory and they're negative racial slights. And how do they show up? So we're going to talk a little bit more about history and then talk about these microaggressions that I'm sure if I name a few, Ramon and Annette already named it, like, where are you from? And when people never know that I'm Latina, they always say, when they find out, oh, you must be Dominican. So that's that stereotype that people have about, oh, so if you're Latina, you must be Dominican. And so we've all experienced that. And I think one of the things that I like to highlight is, and I think Annette, you started to talk about it, is how it's happening among ourselves. So we want to educate the non-Latinos, but we also want to educate within our own community how in our families, had same messages growing up from as you did in terms of how we really talk about in a derogative way anybody with a darker skin within our families, or even people saying, "Oh, we're not racist. My grandfather was Black," or not. And so some of this denial. So some of the things we need to do is speak up. And if we are in a family reunion and somebody says, "Oh, porque ese negrito," that little Negro, and say it in a derogative way, just say, "Wait, let's have this conversation that Ramon was talking about." So we're going to talk about those micro inequities, how they show up at work, and we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson and really some of the research that Dr. Cleland is going to share with us. So I'll start with Pilar.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I am in transition. I'm still in Miami.
Okay.
But I'm actually moving my office out and and moving back to Austin. So I wanted to talk less about I think microaggressions and more about the structure that supports them. And so I think what's really important that we understand is that racism is structural, it's systemic. And so, yes, we have all of these experiences where somebody might say something to us that we consider to be racist, but we really have to look more at what the structures are that support this racism. And so, you know, as we're in the midst of, you know, this moment, not only in the US, right, but in the world, where we are fighting for Black humanity and fighting for reform within the criminal justice system, right, we have to understand that the actions that we're pointing to by police may be by individual police officers, but they are all supported by this larger structure, right? And so that's really what I wanted to talk about. We've been talking a lot about, you know, Latinos supporting this movement. There have been a lot of signs we've seen that say Latinx is, you know, for Black Lives Matter. But we've also been talking about how that suggests that Latinos or Latinxes are outside of the Black community, right? And that's not the case. We are in the Black community, right? Black Lives Matter means that our lives matter as well. And so when we say things like Latinos for Black Lives Matter, we are invisibilizing Black folks within our communities that are, you know, having the same experiences with the criminal justice system, with housing, with education, as what we might say Black Americans are, right? But really we are all Black folks that are being racialized in the same ways. And, you know, a lot of that comes from, you know, much of what we've been talking about thus far about the invisibility of Black folks in our communities. And we tend to equate Latinidad with racial mixture. And when we do that, yes, we're recognizing racial mixture and that's important, but we're also erasing the fact that Blackness exists, right, within Latinidad. And we don't equate Latinidad with Blackness, a little Spanglish. So thinking about those structures, you know, what I'm doing, particularly in Miami, is looking at what happens when you have a city that is majority Latino, right? Where we have, I think more than any other city in the US where Latinidad is really associated with whiteness. And what happens when you are a Black Cuban or a Black Venezuelan, right? Or a Black Nicaraguan in this particular city. And so what I'm doing is looking at the experiences of Black Cubans that came from Cuba during the 60s and 70s, particularly during the 60s when you had this system of Jim Crow, and what happened during that time. When we talk about Cubans in Miami, we talk a lot about this successful economic enclave that was created by people that were wealthy, that were well-educated, that were well-connected, who came here to Miami and built Little Havana. However, at the same time, you had Black Cubans that were coming over that were being excluded from these very spaces. And so part of this idea of where are you from, right? So the microaggression, where are you from, is connected to this piece, right? That Cubans here in Miami have established Cubanness as being white. And so that comes with all of the other structural implications. So in Little Havana, as Cubans are developing this area with businesses and connections and social networks and restaurants and culture, Black Cubans are not welcome in Little Havana. They cannot rent in Little Havana and they cannot, you know, start businesses here at that time. And so what happens is they essentially form outside communities in Allapattah, in Liberty City, in Black American neighborhoods that are segregated because of Jim Crow, right? And Black Cubans are, right, expected to ride at the back of the bus. Black Cubans are expected to go to the Black segregated schools. And so now we're talking about Latinidad in a much different way, and in a way that we don't really pay attention to when we're talking about our histories. This isn't only the case with Cubans, right? This is the case with many other groups. And so some of the work that I've been doing right now looks at, you know, home ownership, right? Rates of income. In the census, Afro-Latinos have lower income, lower educational attainment, lower home ownership, higher levels of poverty and racial segregation compared to white and mixed race Latinos. And so when we look at this, we have to recognize that this Latinos for Black Lives Matter, right, is missing that important connection where Latinos are Black, right? Not all Latinos, but many Latinos are Black. And so they're having these same experiences. And when we look at this inequality gap, we are looking at, you know, non-African Americans who are Black, right, that are also wrapped up in this system of racism in the country. And a lot of this comes from the structures that exist in Latin America. So, you know, this wasn't birthed here in the US. We have anti-Blackness and we have systemic inequalities in all of these countries, right? In Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico, in Brazil. All of these countries have the same systems that we do in the US. They just don't talk about it in the same way, right? So the narrative is one of racial democracy in Latin America that says, you know, we are all, you know, Cuban, we are all Dominican, we are all Panamanian, you know, we don't have to talk about race or racism, right? We're not like the US, right? They've got the Ku Klux Klan, they've got their racial riots, right? They've got their police brutality. You know, we are not like that. And so what happens is that narrative serves to discourage identification with Blackness, which then serves to discourage identification with racial movements that can really work to challenge a lot of these inequalities that exist. And it works, right? I mean, you certainly have a lot of Black movements in Latin America, but you know, for quite a long time in many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, you know, that narrative was very powerful in keeping people, right, from really identifying with Blackness and understanding, right, the work of racism. And so that structure and the way that that narrative goes then supports all of our, you know, discussions in our families about pelo bueno and pelo malo, right? And all of these other, you know, in Cuba tenía que ser negro, right? All of these sayings and what we might call microaggressions that occur. And so we really have to, I think, get real with, you know, Blackness in our communities. We have to get real with our connections with other Black folks in this country, because we are all being racialized in the same ways. We are all being affected by these structures in the same ways. And so, you know, really, I mean, what my work looks to do is to recognize, you know, the work of race within Latino communities, right? Recognizing race and Blackness within Latino communities, and what does that mean? And so I'm also working on a new survey and a set of interviews that looks at Afro-Latinos throughout the whole country, right, even outside of Miami, to really examine people's experiences with racism, where people live, you know, where people have gone to school, et cetera. So if any of you are interested in participating in that, I'd be glad to talk to you. And thank you for giving me this time. I don't want to go over my time.
Yeah, one suggestion, thank you, Daniela. I think it's so important, the work you're doing, is you might want to put in the chat box
Sure.
how people can contact you for
Yes.
that survey. So thanks for that education. Nereida?
Hey, thank you all very much for inviting me to participate. I'm super excited. I was telling Patricia and Josie that this is the first time in my career, and especially in the diversity and inclusion space, that I've been engaged in a conversation about the Latino community and all of the different elements that make us unique in the Latino culture, and particularly talking about Black Latinos, Afro-Latinos. And so I'm super excited, and the dialogue so far has been incredibly rich. So I thank you all for sharing your stories with us. And I find it really fascinating, and even learning about the Cuban culture. So I am Cubana by birth, but grew up in the United States. As you can tell, I'm lighter skinned, but my father is actually Afro-Caribbean. And so my family is a mix of Portuguese, Spanish, Yoruba Indian, and even Chinese. And so one of the things that fascinates me is that aside from the Black community in the Latin culture, we also have other levels of descendancy in our culture. And so I think that there's a richness of dialogue that's still yet to be had. So I look forward to your work, Daniela, in terms of your research, but also hopefully we'll see other work around different aspects. So my role today is really speaking about how microaggressions and or privilege shows up in the work environment. And so Well, I would love to tell you that over the last 25 years, the HR systems and processes in corporate America have gotten better, and they have to some degree. There is still systemic bias that is built into the selection and the promotion and the performance reviews. And it's unfortunate, but that bias tends to stem from us as individuals and how we've been socialized. And so individuals that are running the recruiting process, individuals that are making hiring decisions, we all carry certain levels of bias with us. And oftentimes you'll hear this in corporate America termed as unconscious bias. But let's be real, there is definitely conscious bias that also happens in the corporate space. And that conscious bias tends to be, what school did you go to? What community did you go to? Oh, you're from the Dominican Republic. I'm from the Dominican Republic. Oh, I'm from Cuba. And so there are different levels of bias that show up in the selection processes, but also promotions and in performance reviews. We do know in the corporate space that for individuals that are either Black, Asian, or Hispanic, depending on the corporation's journey around diversity and inclusion, and depending on whether or not in that journey, the systemic HR processes, whether they've been addressed or not, may influence what your performance in terms of rating is that you might get. And in those organizations where there has been a bit of work done on diversity, but not deep enough to address those systemic issues, you find that consistently minorities get rated lower in performance ratings. You consistently find that individuals that are ethnic minorities are not provided with the same level of opportunities to be promoted or given the same access to special assignments that allow them to grow and develop in the organization. And the distinguishing factor oftentimes tends to be who is your sponsor, not who's your mentor, because we've done a lot of work and conversations around mentor, but it's really about who is sponsoring you, who's bringing you along with them as they move through the organization. And there was a study that was done a number of years ago by Dr. Donna Blancero when she was with Arizona State University that showed that having a corporate sponsor that is white made a $10,000 difference to an ethnic minority Latino in terms of their overall pay and capability to increase earnings. If you had a sponsor who was Latino, then you probably had the opportunity to increase your salary base by about $5,000. And so you have these disparities in the system that occur. How microaggressions show up for men that are Latino and women that are Latina are very different. How it shows up for women in particular is if you're a Black Latina, if you are a Latina, or you're just a woman, you oftentimes are discounted, not once, not twice, but maybe 3 different ways. And even within the community with regards to our male counterparts, you might be discounted by Black males, you might be discounted by Latino males, who are also competing for the same kinds of jobs and opportunities. So as Latinas, we're really facing not double indemnity, but 3 times as much challenge and to move through the corporate structure. Now, if you're a light-skinned Latina, your chances increase. You get invited to different meetings. You might be brought along a little faster in the talent pipeline. But can I tell you that's definitive research? No, because I haven't seen definitive research. I can share with you what my observations are from the last 25 years. If you're Latino and you're Black male, you oftentimes get categorized as a Black male, not necessarily recognized for your Latino skills and background and capabilities, which is unfortunate. So there are definitely a lot of still double standards. How microaggressions show up for Latinos, it's, are you being invited to the right meetings? who's bringing you? Are you being invited to that dinner of that executive leader who has a team of 20 people? If you're Latina, the other concern is, are you single Latina or are you a married Latina? If you are a single Latina, chances are you're not going to be invited to that executive's home. And I was told once, it's because you might be a threat to the spouse. And so no leader, no male leader wants to bring a Latina to the home that might be attractive because they're concerned about how that might show up. Having run women's leadership programs, I can tell you that that particular topic has come up, and I've had to coach males that are mentors or sponsors of women about the fact that it's okay to have dinner with a female. It's okay to have lunch and be seen with that female. And if the assumption comes up, then it's your job to correct the assumption and set things straight. But you cannot block and or not bring someone with you if they have the skills and the capabilities that you need for your team. How microaggressions also show up are you being invited to the Rotary or the Masons? Are you being invited to Shriners? And so what are the social groups that allow you to excel and form bonds and opportunities to get ahead in the organization? And then there's the additional issue around accent. There have been a number of times when I have been told by other colleagues, and even at where I work currently and the other companies that I've been at, where the question has come up around accent. And so how are you expressing yourself? You would think that nowadays accent wouldn't matter in the corporate place, but it does in some companies. And so how do you fit in? How do you mold yourself to fit in? Should we have to change ourselves? My thinking is we shouldn't have to change ourselves. And I work towards eliminating those cultural biases. But there are still individuals in the marketplace that think that these are things that need to be corrected because something's wrong with us, right? And that's unfortunate. And then in terms of, examples, I can share a bunch of examples with you. Being a more fair-skinned Latina, I've experienced being discounted on both sides. So I remember when my family was moving from Chicago and we were going to Miami, that I was not accepted in the Latino community in Miami because they thought I was too Americana. And then on the other side, when I was in college, that my college friends thought I was too Cubana. So, as Latinas and as Latinos, we experience bias in several different levels. And so I found I was more comfortable hanging around with the kids that were nerdy or the kids that were Asian because I felt much more accepted. I also found myself feeling more accepted by my Black colleagues and my Black friends than I did being in a room where there were white individuals. And because we shared a common bond of being discounted in some way or another. And so I think it's really important to be conscientious of where do you feel the most comfortable and understanding the corporate cultures that you might be part of, because oftentimes in those corporate cultures, there are also subcultures and there are expected behaviors of how you need to navigate the organization. Does that mean that you change completely who you are? No. But it does mean that you have to learn what the unwritten rules are of the game in order to be able to navigate. And I did love the comments that Ramon made around living in the hyphen, because I've felt like I've been living in the hyphen, since, I came to the United States, because I've always had one foot in the Latin culture and one foot in the American culture. And so I think it's really important that you find a way to navigate for yourself and define who you are at your core so that you can stand up for yourself and not adopt other people's perceptions that are placed on you.
Thank you. I was looking at the chat and everybody is relating there was a question, but I think you've already answered it in terms of how can I be authentic, and your last words in terms of making sure you understand who you are and understand the subculture and always understand the unwritten rules. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. There was just that question that I see there.
Yeah, I think you have to be really true to yourself. You know, you define you, whatever that is, and then you work through the system. You look and you find people that you can ally with. There are a lot of really good allies out there that can help you navigate the corporate culture of the organization, but you have to stay true to who you are. You can't be changing yourself every time you move to a different job or to a different community. And so I would say spend the time to work on you and define who you really are for you. And even within your family, sometimes you have to call out and say, no, don't label me. I'm not the niña. You know, you need to call that out and have those tough conversations.
Great. So thank you. As we've experienced, we could probably spend the rest of the afternoon talking about this and actually learning from all our speakers, but we have more to come. I want to hand it over to our next speaker, who is Daisy Over Dominguez. Daisy, we go back a while. I haven't seen you in person in a long time, but I'm so happy to have you here and share your experience. So Daisy.
Thank you, Josie, and I'm thrilled to be here and see so many friends. The way that we're seeing friends nowadays, right? Via video. I want to first of all say thank you. I think these are the kinds of conversations that I'm finding actually that a lot of young Latinx folks are having a lot more than my generation. And I say that, I should begin by saying I'm Dominican and Puerto Rican. My parents had me here in New York City. I was born in New York City. They were teenage parents, and my paternal grandparents offered to raise me in the Dominican Republic. So I did the opposite migratory pattern. I was born here and raised in the DR in Santo Domingo. And I was raised, like most of us in the Caribbean, in a very racially mixed culture and family where racism was prevalent. That's the only way that we can say it. It's in the coded, forget coded language, which is I think the nice way that we use in America. It was very much the terms that we have used, negrita, pelo malo, all of those things were the things that I grew up. And literally, if you put my family, you can put us on a color prism, like I suspect most of us. And I have a brother who is blonde with blue eyes. And I have my cousins who walk anywhere and they're assumed that they are African Black. And we're all in between and we are all related. And this concept of the comfort that we have with mestizaje and anything that says anything other than Black is very real. And that has been so deeply embedded in our identities. And for me, being raised in the Dominican Republic, it wasn't until I moved to the United States that I truly had an opportunity to learn about even my own background and my own Haitian lineage and who we were. These were things that were not part of my identity formation in the early stage of, in my early development. And I share all of that because what I know has been deeply informed through literature. What I know has been deeply informed through academic research. And then what I know has also been deeply informed by my own experiences and questioning them now as an adult. And that is where, from a generational lens, many of us are. And I think that there's a bit of a grace period that I offer to folks in the older generations, although my family knows very much that, I joke with them. I'm the chief people officer at Vice Media. I have been in the diversity and inclusion space for 2 decades. This is what I do. This is what I call out. But we still have tensions around how race shows up and the language that shows up. And I'm comfortable having those tensions. And I'm comfortable creating language and lifting up that language. I find that the younger members of my community are far more comfortable in challenging it and in redefining it. And I think that that's part of what this is going to look like. And in claiming our racial heritage and claiming it in a way that is not about, this is the cool thing to do now, but simply, I sent an email to the entire company that I work for now as an introduction post the George Floyd murder. And my first lines were, this is not how I intended to introduce myself, but as an Afro-Latina, I need to explain to you who I am and why this is important to me and why I speak in solidarity. And I wouldn't have done that 20 years ago in my career. I'm in a place where I have a different level of confidence, a different language, and I think that that's part of the evolution. So I'm sorry, because I think that's farther than what I had been asked to speak about, but I think that that context is really important. I was asked to talk about allyship. And I think it's really interesting in the context of what many of you have been sharing, that we tend to think about allyship from a dominant and non-dominant lens. And the fact of the matter is that we all have very different privileges, right? We have privilege that shows up, and it's both positive and negative. I have privilege of being a relatively light-skinned Latina, and in the workplaces that I work, they get that I'm brown, but they do not react to me the way that they would if I was of darker skin and if my hair looked any different. And I'm fully cognizant of that, and that's a privilege that I carry, and that I fully acknowledge. I have other privileges in terms of education, in terms of having a family, being heterosexual, able-bodied. All of those pieces are part of my privilege, and part of why I can be an ally in a different way, and I can lend a voice in a different way. And so when we talk about allyship, just in terms of some definitions, I like to always say that allyship that doesn't come with solidarity and action is performative. And we're seeing a lot of that right now all over the place. We're also seeing a lot of companies sort of, becoming newly woke to the fact that racism even exists, and which, I find somewhat humorous right now. But fundamentally, allyship is about sacrificing your own comfort for that of others, such as people who are different from you, or people who may look like you and have different access and opportunities than you. Dr. Jennifer Sandoval, who is an academic in Florida, once told me, Daisy, there are no badges for allies. If you have to name yourself an ally, you have to question why someone doesn't recognize you as an ally. And I think that, to me, that's the best way for me to define allyship, is about how you show up, who you show up for, and when you show up. And that means questioning language. That means in our families, in our communities, in our workplaces. That means refusing to tokenize Black, Indigenous, and people of color in every practice that you have. That means, again, trying to amplify and lift up the voices that are not being heard. That means actually doing the work. And part of the work is understanding the language, understanding the history, understanding the legacies. I'm a big fan, and I love to talk about Dr. Kimberly Cranshaw's term of intersectionality. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the idea that people experience discrimination differently. And we've talked about that today, and that's depending on overlapping identities. I'm a woman of color, I'm Latina, class, all of that. But to me, the concept of intersectionality that Dr. Crenshaw has stated is far more powerful, because it's not concerned simply with the items around identity and representation, which are important in and of themselves, but it's far more interested in the deep structural and systemic questions about discrimination and inequality. And I think fundamentally, we can't speak about race in the Latino community if we don't talk about discrimination, if we don't talk about inequality, if we don't talk about the fact that it has impacted all of our access and opportunity. It's impacted even those of us who are able to be in this conversation and to talk to each other about it. And so to me, the concept of allyship is, how do we become our own allies? How do we become allies for our community in every engagement that we have, in every opportunity that we have? And how do we own that word so that it's not only defined as it often is, and I give talks about this from, hey, white people, here's what allyship means. Hey, people of color, here's what allyship means. But I don't often get to be in a conversation like this when I'm talking about the complexity of us people of color, and us Latinx, and us Afro-Latino, Black Latino. I get asked the question about terminology all the time, And I often respond back, I'm like, whatever makes you feel more comfortable, I'm good with. I was like, whatever you want to identify with, when you walk out of the door, whatever that is your identity. And Josie, you said it. Some days I'm more of a mother than I am a professional. Some days I am more one thing than I am the other. Some days I'm more Dominican than Puerto Rican. You know, like all of that changes. And I think there's joy in that. I think that there's power in that. And I think that we've diminished it for far too long because we are battling with some of the semantics, but we're mostly battling with our own issues of power and privilege and discrimination. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, lots to take in. I'm just looking at the time. I think we do have time for questions. If you want to put them into your chat. And as we're waiting, Daisy, can you share with us what's helped you? One of the things I'm hearing is the use of self that I think is so powerful, and sometimes we are not aware of the power we are just by showing up. Sometimes our people don't see us in those positions of power. Mm-hmm. What other ways have you been able to use who you are and be advocate and paving the way?
You know, I think it's taken us all a long time, right, Josie? When I met you about nearly 2 decades ago, and
don't tell everybody my age.
We're very young, both of us. But you know, I didn't have this confidence then. And part of building that confidence for me was, entering a workplace where people didn't look like me, and where I didn't have someone like you and Dr. Ella Bell, who introduced us. Who's a dear mentor and who helped me find a language for who I was and how I showed up in the workplace, and what all that sense of discomfort that I felt all the time, what that actually was. So I've spent all of this time, and I've had the privilege of being able to do this professionally also, and spending my time. But I think we can all be students, and we can all test it out. But I've done that. And so for me, it's been about mentoring others. For me, it's about being mentored by others like you. And then it's also about taking cues from others. So one of the things that I had a young Latinx woman tell me recently, she said, after I was in a meeting with you, I started showing up in meetings differently, because I noticed that you put your arms around the chair like this. And, and I joked, and I laughed at it. And then I said, oh, I started my career in finance, and I realized that men, particularly white men, used to take up a lot of space physically in meetings. And I'm 5'2", and sort of not the tallest person in the room. And so I started, sort of emulating, how do you hold space? So it's not taking space from others, but how do I hold my space so that people know that I'm here? and that people see me in the same light. And that's one little tool and I actually hadn't realized that I did that. But it was really powerful for me to hear her say that, because she started sort of walking a little differently. And sometimes we diminish our own light, and we diminish our own power by not, by not walking into it. And that's one of the things, like, we talk about not letting other people diminish our light, but sometimes we do that to ourselves. And so part of what I do sometimes is remind myself, kind of like when people talk about the Superwoman stand or Superman stand.
Right.
I remind myself, I'm like, oh, I'm in this meeting. I deserve to be here. And when I'm here, I'm gonna add value.
Right. Yeah. So I love what you said, and I'm sure you references Amy Cuddy's book on presence, yes. Where we do need to take the space because we tend to minimize. So I do have a question here. There were 2 questions. One is, when you're having those challenging conversations with your family, because a lot of it, as we said, comes from our families and the dichos, what we hear growing up. What's the language? Like, what has helped you in starting that conversation? Because I always say, we don't want to humiliate, we want to educate. So how do we get that across? So that was the question.
It depends on the situation. I'll tell you, I'll tell you 2 short instances. I'm on a WhatsApp group with all of my high school friends from the Dominican Republic. And by high school, I mean we went to school from 3rd grade till we graduated. And, you know, and there's language when they speak about America and racism, particularly in the last couple of weeks, that is really offensive. And by the way, this is coming from Black Dominicans. And so depending on the day, I will literally write a line and say, hey, Eddie, just as a reminder, you're a Black Dominican too. And here's some things that you should know. There's other days where I just drop in some articles and some, you know, depending on my mood and or how angry I am. With my family, we recently, you know, we have 2 baby cousins right now, and they're both about 1 year old, and we are on Zoom calls every week because that's what we all do now. And it's the DR, it's here, it's LA, it's my family all over. And we do this every Sunday. And the babies are now starting to talk and get more involved in the Zoom. And they're both very different. One's very fair skin, one's much darker skin. And, you know, and we're starting to refer to them as like, mira el pelo malo, y no te pongas fea, y mira la nariz. You know, all of these things that are like literally make, you know, my husband knows because I literally, my skin crawls. And every week, whenever that happens, because I've already established that relationship with my family, every time that it happens, I'm not beyond chastising and shaming my cousin who does it. And so I'll be like, you know better than that. That is not language that we use. That is not what we, and so for me, it's sort of this muscle building, but I've been doing it for a really long time. And so I wouldn't recommend that you go into chastising right away. But I've gotten to the point which, you know, and sometimes I just look at them and go like, you know what I do for a living. It's like, you know, so I can, there's humor, there's, you know,
Right.
sort of the stern face, but there is always that element of that educational piece. And also I have a daughter who is mixed. My husband's white American. And so she's on these Zoom calls. And I often use her as an example. I was like, you can all have your conversation, but in this house, this is how we talk about race. And this is how we talk about how we show up. And I need you all to respect that. And so it's an ebb and flow, and it depends on, I've spent years talking about this with them.
Great, great. I know there's lots of other comments. Love everything you said. I want to give it over to Patricia because I think she had some summary points and also wanted to open it up a little bit more. So Patricia?
Sure. Daisy, thank you so much. Thank you to all of the speakers. Right now, we'll open it up if there are any questions to any of our speakers. So please send in your questions. And while you're doing that, again, just want to thank you. We've heard a little bit about some of the personal experiences, about not only some of the history and the context behind that, the microaggressions and white privilege in the workplace, but most importantly and above all, is how are we being allies within our own community? And I think that is extremely powerful. And we want to ensure that this is a great conversation today, but that we're continuing the conversation. Did we have any other questions come in?
We do. We have quite a few. And so one of the questions is regarding the recording. So as mentioned there, we will be sending out the recording once we get approval from our speakers. There's also another request because not only have the panelists, but also the participants, thank you to everyone, have been sharing really great resources. So we will compile them and be sending that after this meeting. So there's a question here. As Daisy mentioned, there tends to be conflict within Latinx families among the younger and older generations and this awareness of this discussion, as she just mentioned. So what are your recommendations for addressing with our older generation relatives about their language?
I think, Josie, was that the last one that we addressed?
Oh, how to have that family conversation. Yeah, we did. There is one that piggybacks onto that one is what backlash do you get from family, community, and the Black community as you express your Blackness? Because that is, you know, when somebody mentioned we're in both, I think, Narita, you talked about how, you know, the white community might not see you as white, and the Cubano, that happens to me too in terms of Black and Latina. So question to any of our panelists, how do you handle the Black backlash that you get from family, community, and the Black community as you express your Blackness? Is a question.
That's a good question.
I can start, and anyone else. I mean, I think, listen, that backlash is always going to exist because as a nation, we're just highly uncomfortable with race, and we're highly uncomfortable having these conversations. And so I don't think it's something to be solved for with one conversation. I think it's part of relationship building. It's part of understanding identity and sharing what your identity is. It's part of being able to have that moment of, I am not trying to own this space for you and take this for you. And I think that's really important. And that's, I mean, again, back to the conversation around allyship, is being able to know when to stand forward and when to stand back. And there's conversations that I know that even, as I just said, I identified as an Afro-Latina, that I will not get ahead of for the Black community, because that is a conversation that the Black community needs to have. And I am there to help facilitate it. I am there to support it, but I'm also very clear of, like, I'm not going to co-opt this conversation so that about the racial challenges of being, a colonialized Caribbean Latina. It's like that's not, this is not about oppression Olympics. This is about being able to really, truly center on where the harm and where the needs are, and create that space for that. And so I think that it doesn't happen overnight, but to me is around the language of, I am not centering myself in your conversation. I'm trying to center what needs to be centered, and trying to understand and trying to get to a place of reconciliation and connection, not retribution.
This is Annette. One of the things that I would like to share, and I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but it's understanding that there's privilege, and this might sound weird, but there's privilege in being an immigrant, right? So just like Neneira was saying, like when it comes to Black Cubans, how they might be, not that maybe fine, let me rephrase, that they are discriminated against by white Cubans, but white Cubans might treat me different because I'm not their Black, right? The same thing with the Panama. I might be treated a different way by white Panamanians, but here, because I'm not from the U.S., Domingos, blancos, treat me a total different way. And then within that, understanding my privilege within that I'm not as Black as so-and-so. My hair, north side, mild like so-and-so. So all these things, I think it's important. Also, it's important to recognize that we have weaponized our privilege as Afro-Latinos against African-American people. So it's really important that when we talk about us being allies within the Black community as a whole, we need to understand that the treatment of Black Americans or African Americans is different than we as immigrant Black experience. And I think one of those is because, my Black roots come from the Caribbean. So Grenada and St. Lucia. So in Panama, we were never the same as the Blacks that were brought there as slaves by the Spaniards. We came as workers, and that mentality is different. When you migrate to the U.S., you came as workers, or you had a better education, or you didn't.
I thought it was just me. Annette, I think we're experiencing some sound issues here. So we're going to get ready to wrap up and share with everyone in terms of what's next and some opportunities. But really quickly, I'll start off with all of our speakers today. If you can, we can just wrap up, maybe share a resource or a final thought to conclude today's conversation that you would like to share with our audience. So I'll start with the very first, Ellie. Ellie, are you still here?
I am here. I am just on mute and just having to unmute myself. So I think that the most powerful resource that we can put to use is exactly what Ramon said, which is to start the conversations at home, within our community, with our friends, with our families, with our neighbors. These microaggressions and even just the small comments that we have at family gatherings, like Daisy mentioned, are where it starts, right? And sometimes we keep our mouths shut because we don't want to stir trouble. We don't want to cause division among family, but we're causing division by keeping our mouths shut. Mm-hmm. Those little microaggressions, they hurt, they build up, they build resentment, and that eventually can lead to disunity. So let's develop the courage that we need to be able to have those conversations and to be able to just approach those people that we care about these very sensitive and delicate issues. And that can be the beginning of really pushing forward with change in our communities.
Thank you. Ramon?
Yeah, thanks. For me, I definitely agree with those points. And I think the other thing is, how do we create those spaces in our workplaces? And how, again, how do we create and facilitate spaces for dialogue? So I would really recommend a great book that I'm rereading right now is We Can't Talk About That at Work by Mary Frances Winter, some of you may know, who's a real legend in the field of diversity and inclusion. And I think the model and frameworks that she talks about really go towards what Daisy says, like how do we separate this and take away the tension of these conversations so that it's not about being attached to identity. It's around really talking through each other's perspectives and truths. So thank you.
Thank you. Annette, I don't know if you have anything to add?
No, I already spoke.
Okay, gracias. Josie.
Yeah, I think lots of resources, and we're seeing it at the chat. One of the things I recommended was just to go back to the book Down These Mean Streets by Piri Thomas that talks about Puerto Rican growing up in the whole colorism experience. So it's just to understand a little bit more of our history, that it's been with us for forever. And then there's two women who have put together a campaign, an awareness campaign for media, Proyecto Color, and it's just to talk to the media and how we're represented or not represented in on TV and social media. So I would offer that.
Gracias. Danielle?
I don't know if she's on. Is she there? Okay, good.
Sorry, I was on mute. I didn't realize. I put some of the resources throughout the chat, so that if those are distributed, then that would be great. But I mean, for me, the biggest thing pertaining to this conversation is our Black Latinas Know Collective, because we're producing a blog each month and we're on Twitter. We just finished a 2-day kind of Twitter explosion of talking about Blackness and Latinidad. And so, there you can find a lot of other Black Latina academics that are doing work on this, and you can follow their work as well. So it's all there on the website.
What is the name again, Danielle, so I can put that in the chat box?
Black Latinas Know Collective.
Thank you.
I have put it in there also, so it's there.
Thank you.
Sure.
Nettie?
Oh, well, I think from just the things that I saw in the chat box and that have been shared, there are a lot of really great resources. I would say take one step after today's call to identify where you want to start the conversation, because it's great that we're having this dialogue, but the next step is, what actions are you going to take in order to become an ally, or to have the discussion with your family, or to make the workplace a better place? So I would say take action.
Gracias, Nettie. Daisy?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with all of my fellow speakers today. I'm gonna be a little self-serving here, and I'm actually doing a TED Talk in 2 weeks that's talking about how to drive an inclusion revolution in the workplace, and it's about what we've talked about today. Thank you all. It's about holding up a mirror. It's about taking action, and it's about persisting in the face of discomfort. And we all need to. That's part of this work. I think my last piece of advice is that this work is really hard. It is triggering for many of us. It's exhausting, it's challenging because it's systemic, and because it requires us to uncover narratives and practices that have been fueled for a long time and have gone unchallenged for a long time. So, as I tell my team all the time, is one foot in front of the other, and hold hands. Because I do believe that we can do this together. I love all the resources that are there. One of the books that everyone's asking for resources outside of just the Latino community. So I've been sending folks to Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. EJ Oma's book, so you want to talk about race. There's a lot of really great books out there, which, by the way, I've heard that are like sold out right now. But if you're gonna, my advice is, if you're gonna read it, practice what you read. Right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daisy. And last but definitely not least, she's going to take us home. I asked Sarah Taylor, who is also on our Young Professionals Board of HACE, and also the founder of Yo Soy Ella, will be wrapping us up today. Sarah.
Oh my God, you said take us home. Wow, that's a big responsibility, Patricia, but thank you. And the reason why I say that, because there were so many significant eye-opening facts and gems that were being shared amongst this forum, that as an Afro-Latina myself, I identify as Afro-Latina, I identify sometimes as a Black Latina, I identify myself even as Afro-Panameña. It just really showed that there's so much layers to this identity and to this diaspora that we sometimes overlook, but it comes to the forefront when these kind of moments in times in history shows up. It's a Panameña, let's go. So I get excited, sorry. So real quickly, I am Sarah Taylor. Like Patricia stated, I am the founder and executive director of Yo Soy Ella, and I'm also privileged to be a part of the HYPD board and the auxiliary board of HACE, which serves the young professionals. And just to continue on this conversation, we'll also carry on this conversation. We don't know, we can bring on the heftiness and the great panel that you guys have presented, but we'll try to emulate it as much as possible, because this is a great talking point to bring the Generation Zs and the millennials into this space. And like I said, it opened up an eye for me as a millennial, and as an Afro-Latina living experience, some things I just never knew of. But a few things that I kind of I took away. One of the most significant thing is just understanding the intersectionality with Latinos, and the fact that a lot of Latinos who are non-Black miss that there is intersectionality when it comes to the African diaspora, when it comes to Black and Afro-Latinos, and those overlapping identities that we kind of miss. And another thing I took away was the microaggressions. And I love the point that, I'm sorry, I'm from Mr. Name, but I love so many great things. I'm sorry, I'm so excited. But the great point that was brought up regarding allyship and understanding that sometimes in the workplace it's going to be difficult addressing the microaggressions, because there is a culture and the subcultures that come along with that. But reaching out to mentors, and not just only seeking mentors when these things come to place, but also reaching out those allies that can be your mentors as well. And they don't have to necessarily look like you, but they can be great allies when it comes to addressing some of the microaggressions in the workplace. Like even schedule like office hours with them. I thought that was a really good point. Let's see, so many good things. I don't know what else to bring up. Let's see. I don't know. It was awesome. I'm really excited. I'm like a wealth of knowledge just came and smacked me. So it's really hard to put it all together, but the conversation was necessary, phenomenal. And as a Black Latina, I felt even more affirmed and confirmed in where I stand with this discussion. And this was kind of like a good therapy session for me too. It was very healing in a weird sense. I don't know how to say that, but it was very weirdly framed, and it was a healing experience because it just kind of like fortified what I've been saying in a weird way. But yeah, sorry, I had to go. That's it. Sorry.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.